Activist Radio is on the air. You've tuned into the Mark Harrington Show, sponsored by Created Equal. Mark is training a new generation of leaders to take on the culture of death and win.
You don't like abortion, don't have one.
The only thing that can be said to be objective truth is that there is no objective truth.
It does come out in one piece. It comes out in one piece.
I would argue that we certainly are not all created equal.
And now, here's Mark.
What would Martin Luther King Jr. do when it relates to these types of issues? So that's what we're going to be talking about here on the Mark Harrington Show today. Your radio activist and voice of resistance, coming to you live on Facebook and other social media platforms here every Thursday at 1 p.m. You can tune in to these social media platforms here on Facebook, on our Created Equal page and the Mark Harrington page. You can tune in to the Mark Harrington Show. And so today we're going to be talking about buffer zones. We're going to talk about whether pro-lifers are violent lawbreakers, as characterized by some. And so hopefully we're going to deal with these questions. These are a lot of in-house issues, I guess, but I think there's some of the things that need to be addressed when we come to pro-life activism in the 21st century. And the context for all of this is what's happened and has been happening in Louisville, Kentucky. On May 13, a group of pro-lifers rescued in front of the EMW Abortion Center in Louisville, the last remaining abortion clinic in the state of Kentucky. And they rescued. What do I mean by that? That means they sat down in front of the doors as an act of a witness against child killing. And they sat there in order to block the doors to keep women, men and women, that is, but people from coming inside to kill their babies. And this set off a firestorm of debate within the pro-life movement as to the role of rescuing in our movement. And so if you've been watching the Mark Harrington Show, if you've been listening to us on our podcast, you'll know that we've dealt with this. I had Rusty Thomas from Operation Save America on the show 2 weeks ago discussing rescues. I've discussed them as well on a show earlier in the year as to whether they are the right thing to do, whether they're lawful, whether they're just, or whether they're immoral. But today what we want to talk about are some of the accusations, some of the criticisms that have been levied towards rescuing. When I say rescue, it's that simple act of obedience to sit down in front of a door or to try to, as best you can, to rescue children by blocking entrances to abortion facilities. That's what I want to deal with today. These accusations have not come from the pro-abortion side of things. These accusations have come within our own camp from pro-lifers that disagree with the tactic. Now, let me just say up front, I think it's fine to disagree with a certain tactic. There's nothing wrong with that. But that ought to be kept in-house. Let's talk about it between one another. Let's not air out our grievances, our differences, our criticisms, our accusations of other brothers and sisters in Christ who are just acting in obedience to what they believe they need to do to save children. It's better to keep them in-house. In fact, the Bible prescribes this, does it not? In Matthew 18, Jesus said, if you have a difference with your brother, or if your brother sins, he says, really, that you take one person there first, and if they don't listen to that person, you bring 2 or 3 witnesses, and they don't listen to them, then you bring it before the church. Let me just say, with social media, with all the forms of communication that we have today, people feel free to go online and criticize one another without any reference or thought to Matthew 18. It's like the verse doesn't matter anymore. And when someone like myself says, listen, did you apply Matthew 18 to your disagreements with this brother or sister? Did you go to them in private first before you went public? they always come back and say, well, that it doesn't apply in this case. Isn't that funny? Every time we criticize another Christian, it seems, and someone brings up Matthew 18 as a reason why we shouldn't do that publicly yet, they always say, well, that doesn't apply. And then they give several reasons to why that passage doesn't apply to them. It just seems very convenient, isn't it? We've forgotten that within the disagreements that we might have between brothers and sisters in Christ, we ought to go to them in private first. That is, if it's a sin, and Jesus said it was a sin. If there's just a disagreement as to tactics, I think the threshold should be even higher. Those shouldn't be aired out in public at all, if they're just disagreements in tactics. Now, if somebody's in sin, certainly we should go to them in private, but if there's just a disagreement in tactic, we should definitely go to them in private and try to work it out prior to actually, in the last resort, taking it publicly. But it's interesting to me. I, for one, try to keep my criticisms to myself or to the small group of folks that I associate with. And if I feel it's necessary, I'll go to someone in private, but I rarely go public on any differences that we have with one another in the pro-life movement. And there's a reason for that. First of all, I don't think it's very productive. Second of all, they generally don't change their minds, and it just divides the movement further. Our movement is fractured right now. It has been, of this infighting, people disagreeing with everybody on Facebook. It's just a circular firestorm, circular firing squad that serves no purpose other than the purposes of the enemy. But to say that up front, I just feel like, and the only reason I'm dealing with this today is because those accusations were brought against Operation Save America and indirectly our organization, Created Equal, because of our efforts in Louisville. So when someone comes and attacks us or accuses us or criticizes us, I guess I have the obligation to respond. And that's why we're doing this. Otherwise, I'd just drop it. And most of the time when we're attacked by people, we just let it ride. We don't usually get involved. But having said that and setting that up this way, I'm doing this video and this show right now on this topic simply because it's a debate right now in the pro-life movement as to rescues and what they mean, whether we should be doing them, and all of the questions surrounding them. Now, what I want to do in the short time we have today is just deal with the two main objections that have been raised on social media. Those two main objections have been brought by an organization called Sidewalk Advocates for Life. Sidewalk Advocates for Life, which, by the way, we support. Okay? I am totally pleased the fact that we have the beginnings, and they're a new group. They've been around about 3 years. And their leader, Lauren Mazika, I think it is pronounced. It's difficult to pronounce her last name. But I'm glad that there's a national organization dedicated to raising up and training sidewalk counselors. There's never been one that I'm aware of in the pro-life movement to this level. So we support the efforts of Sidewalk Advocates for Life. I'm glad they're doing what they're doing. We're behind them. Where I disagree is them feeling like they have the only way, that they have the better way, and that criticisms from afar, which people tend to do today from their keyboards, I don't think are productive. But anyway, Sidewalk Advocates for Life is the one that's levied these concerns against the rescue efforts, the tactic of rescue. Now, what I'm going to do, I'm going to deal with the two main objections to rescuing that are contained in a video and in the written statement from Sidewalk Advocates for Life. The first objection or criticism of rescues, and what I mean by rescues is the peaceful, in my view, peaceful civil disobedience, sitting in front of doors, blocking the clinics to keep women from having abortions. The first one is that rescues are not peaceful. Or I guess the counter to that is there are other efforts that are peaceful and rescues aren't peaceful. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to play a video clip that my good friend Dr. Monica Miller, who's a teacher at a college in Michigan, also a 30-year veteran of the pro-life movement, who's been sidewalk counseling for 30 or 40 years, and also is one of the premier defenders of the use of abortion victim photography in our movement. She created a video yesterday in response to Sidewalk Advocates for Life's criticism of rescues. And so what we want to do, we're going to play this video, and then we will kind of unpack it as it goes, and we'll deal with this question of whether rescues are peaceful or not. So, Mr. Producer, if you could, let's cue up that video with Monica Miller. Monica Miller, again, she's the director of Citizens for a Pro-Life Society, a 30-year veteran of the sidewalk, and a hero of the pro-life movement. Go ahead and play that clip dealing with the issue of peace.
Rescues. Many who oppose rescues argue that the action is not peaceful, not prayerful, not pro-woman, and fault the action for not being law-abiding. To characterize rescues as not peaceful is based on a most narrow, restricted idea of what constitutes true peace. Those who, in a non-violent manner, stand or sit in front of the door to a killing center, they are the true advocates of peace, keeping in mind the necessity to always behave in a loving and prayerful manner. Yes, they are disrupting the clinic in the sense that they are disrupting the killing of the unborn, but that doesn't mean that their action is not peaceful. The disruption of an injustice, the prevention of an act of aggression against the weak and the vulnerable, these are acts of peace. It is wrong to characterize acts of disruption with the absence of peace. The critics of the pro-life rescue wish to wrap themselves exclusively in the mantle of peace and superficially characterize any sort of confrontational action as lacking peace when this is quite false.
Oh, there you go. Dr. Monica Miller, Citizens for a Pro-Life Society, a hero of the pro-life movement. By the way, she's rescued probably 100 times, been in jail, I don't know, dozens of times, been on the sidewalk probably 30 years in front of abortion mills across the country. Here's a woman with a lot of experience, understanding, I think, what this whole issue is, this issue of rescuing. Let me be clear, first of all, I'm not promoting rescue. I'm not saying we need to begin to rescue. I'm not saying we need to resurrect rescue, per se. I'm just defending the fact that people have other ways of reaching women going into abortion mills. People have other ways of reaching the culture, and some are more effective than the others, and that's fine. We should have best practices and all that kind of thing. But I'm not going to be the governor of every sidewalk in America, and I don't think anyone else should be too. They shouldn't either. No one owns the public sidewalks of America, and they don't own them in front of abortion clinics. So the idea that we can tell people what to do, no, it's okay to suggest them, but don't criticize those who are out there. I'd rather them be out there and not do it the way everybody else wants to do it, supposedly, than not be out there at all. But okay, so let's deal with this question of peace. She does a very good job about talking about this. Here's the thing. In this statement from Sidewalk Advocates for Life, the word peace or peaceful is used 18 times to describe the activities of Sidewalk Advocates for Life or the pro-life movement, that we need to be peaceful. Now, let me be clear. The pro-life movement is without a doubt the most peaceful, prayerful movement in the United States history. It goes without saying that we're peaceful. When we say that when we categorize or describe our efforts as peaceful pro-life ministry, or peaceful pro-life sidewalk counseling, or peaceful pro-life prayer vigil, or peaceful pro-life outreach, we're insinuating and buying into the idea that there's such a thing as violent pro-life activity, violent pro-life sidewalk counseling or public outreach. We're buying into the caricature, the stereotype, that pro-abortion advocates have levied on the pro-life movement, that we're violent. We're ceding the ground to them. They're actually giving that up to them and admitting at some level that we're not peaceful. I don't know any non-peaceful pro-life activists. Now, there might be some out there. They certainly aren't pro-life. They might be anti-abortion if they're not peaceful, if they're violent. But I don't know any. And for us to characterize our efforts as peaceful all the time, we're kind of apologizing for ourselves. And so I just don't like the term. Now, I understand that the way that they have tried to describe this narrowly, they don't mean nonviolent per se. What they mean is calm, tranquil, safe. I understand that, but that's not what peaceful means per se. I mean, it encompasses those things, but that's not what peaceful means. Peaceful means a lack of violence or aggression. Doesn't necessarily mean calm. You want to come up with another word to describe yourself. If you want to say calm, respectful, and non-threatening, okay, fine. But let's not characterize your efforts as peaceful, which automatically assumes that the other efforts are not. And that's what I think the problem is here, is that by saying that rescues aren't, or that these other efforts are peaceful, they're insinuating that rescues are not peaceful. Now, Dr. King, again, what would MLK do? What would Martin Luther King Jr. do in this situation? He said this: true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. Now, I'm going to say that again. True peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. Now, think about that. Dr. King, obviously, he went to jail dozens of times. He broke the law. He was talking about true peace. The problem that we face at the abortion clinics, abortion facility, is that there's an absence of justice. That the fact is that inside the buildings that we go and stand in front of and counsel, inside those buildings, an injustice is taking place. There is no peace in front of these places. There is no peace inside these places. There's no peace in America as long as we ignore or trivialize the injustice of abortion. And peace in the sense of justice, see? And that's what Dr. King was talking about. Now, also, Dr. King said, and if you would, Mr. Producer, bring up the Dr. King's quote about how injustice needs to be exposed to the light of day. See, when we ignore the injustice inside of these abortion mills, we're not creating peace. The injustice is creating the tension, not us. Not us. That's the problem. Here's what Dr. King said as it relates to exposing injustice. And by the way, this would apply to the use of abortion victim photography, by the way, and the fact that we should not be covering up the injustice of abortion. Here's what he said: like a boil that must be opened with all its ugliness to the natural medicines of air and light, injustice must be exposed to the light of human conscience before it can be cured. See, we don't want to be part of the cover-up. We don't want to be part of the idea that that this injustice should not be exposed, because if it's not exposed, it'll be tolerated. Dr. King believed in exposing injustice. He didn't believe in a false peace, a fake peace, a peace that is a facade, if you will. That's the type of peace that I think is being described, unfortunately, by those who oppose the use of rescuing as a tactic. So I understand what they're trying to say, that peace in their narrow definition means calm, respectful, and tranquil. We want that kind of an environment when we're in sidewalk counseling, when we're reaching women. We don't want it to be chaotic per se, but that's not what peace means. And most Americans, when they see the word peace or peaceful, are going to think it's absence of violence or aggression. There's nothing violent about rescue. In fact, I think it's one of the most peaceful things we can do to show our opposition to the killing. Now, let's move on to the second criticism or accusation that was leveled by the Sidewalk Advocates for Life in regard to the use of rescues as a tactic. And this accusation is that it's not law-abiding, and that we should all be law-abiding. I'm going to let Dr. Monica Miller, again, speak for herself as someone who has spent 30 years on the sidewalk in front of clinics, that is a veteran of the pro-life movement and has the scars to prove it. Go ahead and play the second clip, Dr. Monica Miller from Citizens for a Pro-Life Society.
Why is it that we should just stop our acts of defense simply because laws forbid us to defend the unborn? Laws, frankly, that are designed to facilitate the killing at abortion clinics. Should we do nothing more for these babies once their mothers still intend to abort them? If we put ourselves in the place of the unborn scheduled to be aborted, would we not want someone to plead for us up until the very last moment? The rescuer is performing an act of love, an act of charity on behalf of that abandoned child. And yes, really as beacons of truth and light, they perform an act of love for the mothers as well. The pro-life movement needs these radical acts of love. To be overly obsessed with law-abiding when a law is unjust is not a virtue. No one should ever make a pledge to never break the law when charity may require that those laws be broken. Now, there is a legitimate concern that rescues of the unborn may result in the enactment of buffer zones and thus negatively impact sidewalk counseling efforts.
Yeah.
This is an issue to which rescuers do need to be sensitive, about which prudence should be exercised. Sadly, however, there are many abortion clinics where there are no sidewalk counselors. There is no sidewalk counseling taking place of any kind. Those clinics should be given priority.
Go ahead and stop after this.
Or those who plan to do a rescue should first consult the sidewalk counselors, obtain their cooperation, knowing what risks may be involved.
All right. I think we can leave it right there, Mr. Producer. She does an excellent job in explaining that obeying unjust laws is not a law abiding in and of itself, and that it may demand us to break a law as an act of charity. I know a lot of people are thinking about Romans 13 and the other scriptures in the Bible talking about how we should obey the civil government. Listen, Christians are the most law-abiding people in the country. It goes without saying, right? Aren't we? And pro-lifers are the most law-abiding people in the country. But the question is, at some point, some laws which are unjust should be broken. If we don't break them as an act of charity, as she puts it, don't we just lend to the idea of tyranny and that the government can continue to crush the rights of freedom-loving, liberty-loving, law-abiding people across the country without any kind of recompense, any kind of comeback? I mean, if we just allow them to run roughshod over us, how is that defending the preborn? So we should be law-abiding. We should follow and the laws that are enacted by the civil government. But some laws are unjust and, on occasion, deserve to be broken as an act of charity. Again, what would Martin Luther King Jr. do? What would Dr. King do? What would M.L. King do? He said, Dr. King, here he is pictured in jail. So obviously he was not a quote unquote law abiding in the strict sense of the word. He said this. Here's a couple quotes from him. An unjust law is no law at all. He also said that the most lawful thing to do in some cases is to break a law if it's unjust. And he said this, a just law, which is a man-made code that squares with the law of God, and this is the important part to understand here. A just law or a man-made code that squares with the law of God is in harmony with the understanding that we should have about law. So just laws square with the law of God. So this law, let's for an example, this buffer zone law is an unjust law. Now, whether you want to break it or not, I guess it's up to you and your own conscience. And you might want to think about whether it's effective or not and that kind of thing. But these folks in Louisville broke that law because it should be no law at all. And therefore, in my view, are law-abiding because they're upholding the law of God. Okay? The fact that they're killing babies inside is an unjust law. That's legal in America. We should be defying Roe v. Wade in certain instances, for an example, right? Just today, I don't know if you're watching the news, but in Oregon, Oregon has become the first state in America, first state in our nation that is now paying for every single abortion that takes place in that state by tax dollars, by tax funding. Now think about that. If you were Henry David Thoreau, who refused to pay his taxes because he did not believe in war, at what point do we say to our government that we are no longer going to abide by that law because it's unjust? For an example, in Oregon, if you're a taxpayer, at what point, I mean, maybe this is the point, do you say, I'm not going to pay my taxes to the state of Oregon because it goes to the shedding of innocent blood and killing babies? See, we continue to be law-abiding, but sometimes we obey the wrong laws. I think if I was a taxpayer in Oregon right now, I wouldn't be paying my taxes. Just FYI. Now, I understand our taxes and our money goes to pay for abortion indirectly here and there, but in that case, it's overt. The taxpayer money is going directly to fund abortion. Every abortion in Oregon now receives tax funding. At what point do we say that's not a just law, and in order to be truly law-abiding and obey the law of God, we are going to defy that law? So I don't think it's a virtue, as Monica said, that we just are law-abiding all the time and we just follow the law all the time. Now, she brought up one very good point, which I will grant to my friends at Sidewalk Advocates for Life, and that is this. There are those who begin to break law, who then say it's okay to break further laws, and they become lawbreakers as a rule, and that lends to chaos, that lends to the law of the jungle, unfortunately, and that can lead to vigilante justice, unfortunately. I think that's a concern that we might have. But if we do it in a peaceful manner, and we're laying down our lives for our friends, and we're not doing it in anger, we're not doing it in hate, we're doing it as an act of charity, then I don't think this is a concern for us. Because we're willing to take whatever penalties that come upon us. We're willing to go to jail if necessary. These folks were willing to violate the Freedom to Access Clinic Entrances law. Therefore, they were willing to go to jail up to 6 months and pay a $10,000 fine, more than likely. They were willing to accept the penalties. See, to me, if that's the mindset going in, there's very little likelihood that this is going to lend to becoming a vigilante justice. So I share the concern. I think if we do it in the right spirit, it generally won't be a problem. Also, the idea of if you're going to rescue, that you consult with the local sidewalk counselors, I agree with that. Doesn't mean you have to have consensus. Doesn't mean you have to have permission to do it, per se, because they don't own the sidewalk. But we ought to be at least cognizant or aware of the fact that these folks are there day in, day out, regularly. The locals are the ones who are going to be there, and we ought to be consulting with them because there are going to be ramifications, more than likely, that might in some ways affect them, and they should be aware of that. It would be best to get their agreement if that's something that's going to be done. So I understand we need to be working with the folks who are generally on the ground regularly before something like this is attempted. I don't believe that was done in Louisville. Probably was a bad idea. But the fact of the matter is the local community itself, maybe not the sidewalk councils directly, worked very closely with Operation Save America. Finally, on this point of law-abiding, being law-abiding, the Bible is full of men and women of God who broke the law in cases where they were forced to either obey the law of God or obey the law of man, and they chose the law of God. The apostles, for an example, said they needed to obey God rather than man when they were commanded to not preach the gospel. All right, so moving on, and then we're going to wrap this up. Folks, this video by Monica Miller, if you want to watch the entire thing, you can go to our Facebook page or YouTube page. We have the entire video. It's about 9-10 minutes long total, and it deals with all the questions of rescue. Let me just say this as it relates to sidewalk counseling, or for that matter, any tactic. Tactics are different than strategy. People need to understand that. Strategy is the overarching, overall program, vision, mission. It's the general umbrella in which you attack a certain thing, a problem, for an example. So that's the strategy. Underneath the strategy are the individual tactics to which a person might, or an organization or group, might use to execute the strategy. The tactics are just part of the strategy, okay? Sidewalk counseling is a tactic. Going to college campuses using victim photos is a tactic. Political action against abortion is a tactic, right? They're all tactics. So there's a difference between tactic and strategy. Sidewalk counseling is important and necessary, like any other tactic, but it's not sufficient in and of itself to end abortion. No tactic is. Going to college campuses isn't enough. It's a tactic to end abortion. The strategy to end abortion will include all these tactics, but in and of themselves, by themselves, in isolation, are not sufficient. On its own, sidewalk counseling, like any other tactic, or for that matter, rescue, is not sufficient enough to end abortion. Sidewalk advocates for life say that that sidewalk counseling is used to chip away, and I'm quoting, chip away at Roe, one woman at a time. Now, sounds good, right? It sounds good. Question is that the way to end abortion? To me, sidewalk counseling is a tactic. Rescuing women and babies from abortion mills is a tactic to the overall strategy of ending abortion. Now, if the tactic is to shut down the abortion clinic to reduce demand, I could see that being more of a chipping away at Roe. But we are simply, at sidewalk counselors, simply rescuing individual women. That's a good thing, right? It changes their hearts and minds, which is a good thing, which can lead to the ending of abortion as a tactic to the strategy. But just as the Underground Railroad in rescuing slaves from the South was a tactic to the overall strategy of ending slavery, it's not sufficient in and of itself. The Underground Railroad was a tactic only. It was not a means or total way of ending abortion. It was a means to the end. It was part of it all. The hiding place, hiding Jews in Germany from the Nazis, was not a strategy to end abortion. It was a tactic to ending it. And obviously there was a duty to rescue those being led away to death, as all the tactics are, but it was not sufficient in and of itself. And that's the same with sidewalk counseling. Believe me, I'm not disparaging it. We do it. But it's part of our overall strategy where we're trying to get at the demand and supply of abortion with many of the projects that we conduct. Let me just say this as well. Put this whole battle of abortion in the context of war for a moment, if you will. Think about war. You have frontline soldiers who are fighting the battle right, face to face with the enemy. That's how wars are won, folks. It's by killing enough of the enemy that you get them to surrender and that you have ultimate victory where you win the war. You win the war with soldiers. You don't win the war with hospitals in and of themselves. Hospitals are important. Triage centers that take care of the hurting and those who have been hurt in the battlefield, that have been injured or what have you, are an essential part of the war effort, but in and of themselves, they are not sufficient. Triage centers like the MASH units, right, that take care of the soldiers that are injured in war are important, but they're, again, not sufficient. So it's a part of the overall strategy, but we win wars primarily by putting frontline troops on the front line fighting directly against the enemy. So again, it's a tactic. Sidewalk counseling is just as rescue is, and by itself, it's not sufficient enough to end abortion. It's one of the many things that the pro-life movement does that's important to do. Now, let me just summarize the efforts in Louisville from my perspective. As somebody who was actually on the ground witnessing what happened, let me kind of give you my take, if you will. And I think this is the way it really should be seen. A couple of things. First of all, the buffer zone that was in place or put into place by the federal government as a result of the rescue on May 13 is gone. It's gone. The government withdrew it. They had a temporary restraining order where they put it in for 14 days. They did not go forward with attempting to put in a permanent buffer zone. Therefore, it's gone. Sidewalk counselors are no longer restrained by the buffer zone. Now, that doesn't mean that it won't come back. That doesn't mean that the city council in Louisville, the Metro Council, won't try to attempt to enact their own buffer zone. I understand that's a looming battle down the road, and it's something we need to be concerned about and deal with. But there's a victory there. The federal government backed down. As far as I can remember, I've never seen that happen before. We saw several babies saved last week as well at the clinic. So these tactics that were supposedly non-peaceful, rescues and all the other efforts, they contributed to saving lives. We've heard of people coming to faith in Jesus Christ because of the efforts of Operation Save America there in Louisville. We've had people recommit their lives to Jesus on this as a result of the efforts down there. And the most important thing, and here's something people understand: Operation Save America and Create Equal just didn't blow in and blow out and leave whatever's behind for the locals to pick up and try to piece together. They worked with the locals. I was at the rallies in the evenings. Those were presided over primarily by local pastors, local leaders of ministries and pro-life groups that were working with Operation Save America to shut down the last remaining abortion clinic in that city. And so they were strengthened, not harmed by the effort. The effort is in a better position today than it was before Operation Save America and its leaders got arrested for rescuing and then spent a week there in outreach in the community. They're in a better place than they were prior to them coming to Louisville. And so the idea that they've harmed the efforts of local people, I think, is incorrect. Now, it remains to be seen whether this buffer zone is going to be put into place. Of course, that's something that's going to be having to be dealt with. On the issue of buffer zones, then we'll end it here, and that is they are popping up around the country. We're going to be fighting one in Toledo, Ohio. We beat back the one here in Columbus. Buffer zones are being instituted around the country, not because pro-lifers are violent, not because they're non-peaceful, not because they're not law-abiding. Primarily, it's happening because the other side is losing the battle, and they are looking for ways to shut us down. Bottom line, as we become more effective, generally it's in front of clinics and everywhere else around the country, they are trying to find ways to shut us down. Buffer zones are not a direct response to rescues per se. Now, I will say this. Rescue starts happening more often. You know, we have to take that into account as to whether these buffer zone laws might start being enacted because the other side is going to say they need them to protect, you know, clients going into the clinics and so forth. But as she said, I think that the law-abiding pro-lifer is going to take those things into consideration. And where sidewalk counselors are already active, those places probably ought to be exempt for rescues, or at least the local folks should be brought into the conversation. So anyway, let's finish with this. I want to play, I want to show a clip, or a short quote, sorry, from Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt, right? Speak softly and carry a big stick, Teddy. And here's what Teddy Roosevelt said as it relates to criticizing others that are in the battle. He said this. And so here is my general standard operating procedure when it comes to other pro-lifers, despite the fact that I have brought up a lot of these issues today in the program. I rarely do this. I only did it as in a defense of those actions that were taken in Louisville. I don't do this on a regular basis for obvious reasons. But when I think the issues that we're dealing with are important enough, I will bring them to the attention of my audience. I'll do it in a respectful manner. Once again, we love the folks that disagree with us. Generally speaking, I wanted to disagree privately, but because this went public, therefore I felt it's necessary that we also go public and defend those who we are in like mind with. So go back to Teddy Roosevelt. Here it is. It's not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how the strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust, sweat, and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, but there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows great enthusiasms, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at the best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at the worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory nor defeat. What a profound statement by Teddy Roosevelt as it relates to the critics. You know, there are a lot of critics of certain tactics in our movement. We are inundated by people who tell us using abortion victim photography, for example, or video in the public square is a bad idea. We're criticized continually, all the time, and I ignore 99% of it. But what he says here, that the credit belongs to the man who's actually in the arena, that's the case, folks. Generally, I wouldn't waste time dealing with this stuff, but it's important on this situation that we do so. You know, there's an old friend of mine that used to say, when asked or told that they didn't like, someone told them that they didn't like the way they were going about something, he said this: I like the way I'm doing this compared to the way that you aren't. And I'm not saying that the critics against rescues or any other tactic aren't doing anything. Many of the cases they are, but in some cases they aren't. They just like to cast stones and dispersions and like the debate and argument. But generally speaking, they're not in the arena. The ones that are in the arena don't deserve the criticism from those who aren't. And I'll leave you with that today. Get in the arena, folks. Get in the arena and fight. Let's all fight together. Our differences, as minor as they may be, can be solved, hopefully, and resolved at least in a respectful way if done privately. To keep that in mind as we go forward in our fight against child killing and ending it here in America, we can have a unified movement that at least keeps our disagreements between one another privately. And if we do it publicly, we do it in a way that's respectful, not judging the motives of those who disagree with us. So we'll see you next time, Thursday, 1 p.m. Eastern Time, here on Facebook and other social media platforms. The Mark Harrington Show, coming to you live from Columbus, Ohio, in the Created Equal Studios. Again, we'll see you next time. God bless you. God bless America. And remember, America, to bless God.
You've been listening to Mark Harrington, your radio activist. For more information on how to become a witness against the evil plague in America, call Created Equal at 614-269-7808, 614-269-7808, or go online to createdequal.net, createdequal.net. Be sure to tune to The Mark Harrington Show next time for your marching orders in the culture war.